Okay, I'm sure people will be joining in as we get moving, so I'll try and keep an ear open for that. So hope everybody's well and staying away from all the craziness with the holidays. I wanted to jump into the news here. I've got, there's some updates on bifacial panels. Actually, they were just talking about testing some bifacial panels where they're getting up to 29% efficiencies, which is pretty high for solar panels. They say that's about 4 to 17% more than traditional panels. So that's good. Residential storage, we've talked about that a bit. And what was a $6.3 billion industry in 2019, they're projecting 17.5 billion in 2024, which is a 23% annualized growth rate. So pretty substantial there. You remember, I think it was last week I mentioned that the Koch brothers bought a utility scale solar installation company. Well, this week, Shell Oil announced that they just bought a big company called Savion, utility scale installation company. They also bought another installation company called Silicon Ranch, and they own Sonnen, which is a residential battery manufacturer. I've heard of Sonnen before. So Shell is getting big into solar. So we're starting to see the diversification, I think, of many of these companies who are sort of, you know, they may not read the fact that fossil fuels are on their way out, which they're probably not. It's going to be a 50-year transition or whatever, but they're transitioning, which is smart corporate policy. They're in the energy business, so they're going to transition. Speaking of Shell, yeah, Don.
Just curious, was that first one, is that an American company or is that a French company, or is it, do they do stuff over here? Savion?
Yeah, they're an American company, utility scale solar. Said they had 18 gigawatts under development at the moment. And in fact, I was going to mention just for you, one of their companies, that one of their projects is in Kentucky. A 200 megawatt solar farm that's going to be built on an old coal mine or an old strip mining area in Martin County, Kentucky. Don't know where that is, but
I don't know where that is either. Yeah, it's got to be in the east. Well,
but
I'm assuming the east is the coal mine. Yeah,
it'll be an 18-month project, 300 temporary jobs, 11 permanent jobs. So that's an example of, you know, with solar, the projects employ a lot of people, but when the project's over, you know, not a whole lot of maintenance requirements, but 300 people for 18 months, and then you move on to the next one. That got me thinking a little bit. We've all been hyping solar and how many jobs and everything, but it strikes me, because of the temporary nature of solar, and you know, that once it's built, there's not much maintenance required. There's got to be an end to the build out. You know, I mean, it's okay, we gear up, we move, we transition, but then at the end of that transition, hopefully these systems are lasting for 25 years. So I'm not quite sure what that means in the industry beyond this. Is it like building the railroads? You know, you employ a bunch of Irish immigrants, and then when it's all over, you kick them out of the bar or whatever. Is that,
or the highways, or the highway system? Yes.
Yeah, of course, highway. There's always maintenance. You know, there's always.
That's what I mean. You think that there'll be, after a while, do you think that there'll be kind of a life cycle to this? I mean, like you said, 25 years, then you have to do something.
Yeah, it could be a lot like telecommunications as well. You build the network, but then innovation keeps changing it, morphing it. You keep adding to it. We're already seeing the advancement of battery integration. That brings on a whole new technology. Then we see the integration of automobiles into the electrical grid, and that brings on. Then we start to see, I don't know, generation of hydrogen fuels out of excess capacity. So who knows where it ends, if it ever ends, but it's something that I think we should keep in the back of our mind, that just because you have a 30% annualized growth rate doesn't mean you will always have a 30% annual growth rate. In fact, you
Yeah.
probably will not, because any mature industry tends to level off. And
If you did, eventually you'd be the entire economy. I mean, you
Yeah.
have to level off. I mean, it's
yeah, in
you,
fact, one of the other things I read, one of these statistics, it was interesting to see. They were saying, like it was a big deal, 1 in 600 homes is now being converted over to solar every quarter. All right, well, that sounds like a lot, but then I was thinking, okay, so 4 out of 600, little less than 1% every year. That's going to be 100 years before we're built out, if
Yeah.
every home was going to get solar. So it wasn't a very impressive statistic.
Yeah.
And speaking of jobs, yeah.
The other question, you mentioned the excess solar. Do you think that the industry is going to be overbuilt like telecommunications was, so that there's so much that you could do electrolysis for hydrogen? I mean, that would be a lot of it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one thing that's going to happen, because again, with the intermittent nature of solar, especially, and of wind, you're going to see that in order to meet peak load capacity, and the economics are in favor of us building to that, but that gives you a lot of time when these systems might be curtailed because demand is just not there for it. So if you get a sister industry of generating hydrogen, from this curtailed power, so you're using it for something, then some of the hydrogen, the fuel cell type technologies that don't make economic sense because of the high cost of producing, storing, and transporting hydrogen, maybe begin to make sense when the cost of it is basically marginalized to almost free, because you're using power that otherwise would have been curtailed. So where I'm thinking about that is perhaps in the manufacture of hydrogen fuels for airplanes, for burning in industry like steel and aluminum, where these are highly intense power requirements, where hydrogen might be a better option than electrical.
You're not suggesting a dual fuel car fleet. You're suggesting it could be used for other things.
No, I don't see hydrogen in cars as an effective solution.
Yeah. Have you seen the last time, I haven't looked at it in a few years, but the planes, hydrogen was not yet compact and energy dense enough to be used effectively, same way that, I've seen 1 or 2 experimental planes doing solar, but when you talk to real aeronautics people, they're like, ain't gonna happen. Even though you fly above the clouds, you're always going to get sun unless you're on the right side of the planet. You're just not going to have the capacity for people and the reliability.
Yeah, I think what I've heard, it's not so much putting fuel cells on airplanes, because fuel cells are very heavy.
Yeah, just like a jet, you'd shoot about fuel.
Yeah, but if you can create fuel, if you can create a liquid fuel out of hydrogen, that is the equivalent energy density of a jet fuel that's created out of petroleum, then I can see that as something that's viable. That's a sort of an existing technology. Just like the space shuttle uses, cryogenically frozen hydrogen.
Right. But to get hydrogen down to liquid, though, that's a lot of electricity in addition to just electrolysis to compress it.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but if you've got abundant, unlimited electricity that's almost free, then those things that don't make any sense today might begin to make sense. So I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm just saying I could see that it's a pathway of possibility, as we overbuild our capacity for the electricity that we need as it's being generated. And we're a long way from there. We're only at what, 20%, but we need to get to 70, 80% before we start to see massive curtailing. We see infrequent curtailing in Texas, for example, or in California, especially with the wind farms. where you might be getting a lot of wind during a period without a lot of demand. But but that's just an anomaly more than an everyday occurrence. So speaking of the jobs, I thought it was interesting. AES, a company, is beginning to manufacture and market a thing they call Atlas, which is a solar installing robot. So just as we're creating these jobs, we're going to outsource them to robots. So it carries the panels, it installs the panels. It looks like a big crane. It's obviously for, you know, utility scale systems where everything's mapped out pretty exactly. But that was interesting. And another thing, Fort Valley, Georgia, they're embarking on a project. They've got 200 electric school buses, and they're going to create a virtual power plant during the day when these school buses are parked. So you've got 200 EVs parked, and now they say it's a 25 megawatt virtual power plant, you know, once all of the batteries are obviously recharged. So that's an example. We've talked a little bit about the vehicle to grid. You know, now you've got vehicle to microgrid for sure. So that's one application where those virtual power plants make a lot of sense. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more about that, you know, virtual power plants as the utilities try and piggyback onto existing capacity, especially of electric vehicles. You know, if they can aggregate electric vehicles in some sort of economic way, then we're going to see that virtual power plant. We're already seeing it with Tesla trying to aggregate some of their customer base into virtual power plants. Probably more important will be the data they can collect from these vehicles, aggregating travel patterns, things like that. You know, I don't know, it's a lot of big brother stuff, but if you're keyed into a network and you can start having billboards changing or messages on your computer telling you 3 miles to the right is a Starbucks and they've got a special on, you know, pumpkin spice lattes or whatever. And we know you like pumpkin spice lattes because you mentioned it to your wife 5 minutes ago. You know, and so they're all listening.
Are the billboards going to be by name too? Jay, we know you're traveling this way.
I know it's spooky. It's spooky. So, okay, and I know Joe is on here, or Joe was, yeah, there. Joe's here under the name of Bruce. So, Joe, you want to give a little quick recap on the webinar on the Build Back Better bill that you listened to?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. It was on the 2 or 3 days ago, or no, last Friday it was. And it was put on by the Pennsylvania Solar Center. There was co-authors, co-contributors that contributed. Say there was a gentleman by the name of Matt Mahoney. He was with the director of the PA Solar Center. He went into federal policies and current legislation, tying some stuff with solar to abandoned mine land. A lot of the focus was on the Build Back Better and where credits are going to be coming from. The next person that basically, well, he's like talking about seize the opportunity, and kind of like the Dead Poet Society, I guess. But the next person was a gentleman by the name of Ed O'Shaughnessy. He was with the NBO of Clean Kilowatt Solar Future Study. He got into that, and I guess they have these federally funded solar studies every 5 years. He was pretty optimistic. And he even left with the kind of like the statement saying that the futures are usually underestimated for what these studies come up with. He was referencing a website, sustainableenergy.org, was created by his committee. And I'm sorry, that was not that with us.
Well, Joe, what's in the bill specifically? I know that I think they've got incentives for domestic production of solar parts, you know, solar panels, inverters, tracking devices, things like that, which would help manufacturers. Is there anything for like consumers in it?
And it's part of the problem here was I was not able to get back into the recording. It was recorded, and I've asked them for the link for the recording, and they haven't gotten back to me yet. It's a little I don't know if I'm going to attend any more of these if I can't get back in and review.
Well, has anybody else read anything about what's in the bill back? We may be talking about vaporware here because, you know, Joe Manchin and that crowd may see that this doesn't happen, but yeah, Don?
I've been following it. I can't remember what was in it now. I do know, to your point, one of Manchin's issues was one of his many issues, let's put it that way, was the solar and the general and energy incentives. Obviously, he's from West Virginia. I think there are a lot of other issues. I know that I can tell you technically, I know that the bill is going through the Senate right now. It's going through the Senate process where they determine which parts are relevant and which parts are not relevant because it's going through reconciliation process, which means only certain types of provisions could be included. You know, they say they're going to try and put it on the floor next week. I think that's very ambitious and unlikely, to be honest. But I don't know. It could happen. But they had, I think they extended all the normal stuff. You know, all the incentives for purchases and stuff, which are going to start going down on the ranging down on the percentages for reimbursement.
Yeah. So you're saying you think the investment tax credit is part of this?
I think it is in there, yeah.
Because right now, my understanding, at least on the residential level, is it's 26% this year, 26% next year, 22% the year after that, and then it drops off the cliff.
I think it's back up to 30 in the in this bill. It goes back up to 30. So yeah, the only years I buy it, it goes down, but then it's back up. It's supposed to go back up.
Yeah, because I wasn't sure if that was part of this bill or if they'll deal with it in a separate bill. Because traditionally it's had bipartisan support, the investment tax credits. So if it's part of this bill, we might see it go down in flames, only to be resurrected as an independent thing, you know, hopefully.
That is possible. The only thing I would say right now is, though, that people, including, you know, this is what Manchin keeps talking about, the issue of inflation and spending too much at the moment. And that is generally giving a bad a resistance to passing a lot of legislation that's going to be putting essentially a tax credit is just another way of spending money for the federal government. It's just an indirect way of doing it. And they in fact even track these things, as they call them tax expenditures. They're considered direct payments in the budget process.
Yeah, and they've even talked about making it a direct payment. So if you're not paying taxes, it becomes a credit.
Yeah, that was another provision of this. That was the big one as far as people who don't pay taxes. I remember Bill said he had worked on the charities and the churches that were going to put up solar panels. This way they could get their money back as opposed to just losing the benefit since they don't pay taxes.
Right. Yeah, I remember back when I was talking to groups and I'd have people say, well, I'm retired and I don't pay taxes and it's not fair. And I said, yeah, you're right. It's not fair that you don't pay taxes.
That's right. I agree.
So, you know, so you'd say, all right, whatever. So, All right, well, we'll see how that comes out. I'm tending to be like on Don's side on this, that I have a feeling this one's kind of dead on arrival, but I've been wrong about most things in politics, at least for the last 30 years. So who knows? We'll see.
Jay, the other big one on this I forgot to mention was the credit for cars, and some other stuff, and the part again that I always like about this bill is they give you a bigger credit for cars if it's built by union labor than if it's built by just regular Joes building cars. So it's a solar, electric car is good, but it's really good if it's built by union labor. Just to be clear,
Okay,
it's really extra.
it's good to know. Of course, in Ohio, we get a credit for the electric car, but then we have to pay extra for the tags. So they take on one hand and give on the other. So
that's right, exactly.
I figure as long as they leave me alone, I'll be happy. So, okay. So speaking of webinars, I just put a link in the chat there of a webinar on the Enphase IQ8 series. I attended a webinar last week, which I found to be very, very good. We've had some discussion about IQ8. Apparently they're shipping right now, the product line. So there are a few changes that I thought were worthy of bringing up. If you want to use that link in the chat, the webinar is kind of lengthy. It's about an hour and a half long or so. I can try and sum it up in a couple of slides that I put. Essentially, let me see if I could share. I've got a couple of these. Before I get into this, as I'm sharing, this is a post that's on the Ohio Solar PV. One of our people, Amy, is trying to sell these kilovolt batteries. Anybody who's interested in this, I mentioned I'd bring it up. She's got 2 of them, never been used. So if you want more information, it's in the Dayton area, 12 volt, 180 amp hour. Anyway, I told her.
Hey, let me ask about that. I'm just curious. You can't really mix and match different battery kinds, can you?
Not really, no. So this would have to be a 24 volt system, or get yourself some new ones.
Right.
The shared windows. Okay, I've got let me see.
Can I ask a technical question since you brought up the battery while you're clearing stuff up? Is there a big difference or an opinion about if you have, I've got a big battery bank in 3 inverters. Is it better to have, right now I've got them all in one big battery bank and paralleled up to the 3 inverters. Is it better to have 3 smaller battery banks with one for each inverter, or to have one big one for all 3? Is there a?
I don't know. Tony, do you have, you're in the battery world. You mean having a battery bank for each inverter, or having all 3 inverters drawing off the same battery?
Let's say I've got 48 batteries in 3 groups of 16. Is it better to have one big group of 48, which is parallel to each of the 3 inverters, or is it better to have each of the inverters have 16 to play with each?
So I would say that it from a resiliency perspective, it's better to separate them.
Okay.
Because if you have one that shits the bed, you're going to knock out, depending on how it's wired, you're going to knock out everything that's kind of related to it, right? So from a resiliency perspective, efficiency-wise, it's probably better to do one lump sum, like anything, right? If you aggregate everything, it's more efficient. But if you disaggregate things, it becomes slightly less efficient, probably not noticeably. I would do it for resiliency's sake. So we're actually working on that in this project in LA with a solar canopy, and that's kind of the conversation is what happens if one of these batteries, and what we're planning is between 40 and 80 kilowatt hour single battery goes down, and the whole hub goes down. What do you do, right? It's kind of so how we're solving that problem is 2 40 kilowatt hour battery packs that are separate but run together. You can store 80 kilowatt hours of battery of juice, but if one of them goes down, the whole asset isn't knocked out.
Okay, and then you just wire each of them into the inverter independently.
Correct.
Okay, interesting. Okay,
And
thanks.
Don, is your system standalone or DC coupled?
It's standalone.
Standalone.
Yeah, that system in particular is standalone. So yeah, that's all there is out there.
Well, that brings up a point I was going to try and raise for discussion here. I haven't gotten into the Enphase thing yet, but it was from the Enphase presentation, because one of their big selling point on the IQ8 is apparently within the inverter itself, there's more sensitive and clever electronics that they kept saying it has now. You don't have to worry about the 1 to 1.5 ratio between inverter and battery bank. And as he was saying that, I was going, I never worried about it before. I'm wondering
What does that
you're
ratio
talking
mean?
about.
What's it mean?
And apparently because my thought was, he was saying now you can use a small battery bank with a large solar array just to kind of convince the system that the grid is still functioning, so that you've got daytime use of power. So this is one of the big marketing they've got anyway with the IQ8 Enphase. You can have daylight service without batteries. The Enphase microinverter will, if you have a transfer switch basically and disconnect from the grid, will function during daylight hours without a battery. So it's smart enough now to recognize and keep the anti-islanding provision turned off. Now that
Hey, do you know if that's a physical? Is that a physical or digital disconnect? Do you know?
It's within the microinverter itself.
So it's a digital disconnect from the grid?
Yes.
Oh, no. Yeah, it's a digital disconnect from the grid, but it's part of a piece of equipment.
Sure.
It's their load management. I forget exactly what they call it, but it's where you're making your connections. You would make a connection to your battery bank, you'd make a connection to your critical load panel, and you'd make a connection to your main load panel, all from that smart switch. But it's basically an auto transformer of some sort that's disconnecting from the grid when it loses signal from the grid. So whether it's electronic or physical, it's probably electronic, I would guess.
But Jay, if it does that, I always have the issue of, let's say that happens and you don't have any battery, which I agree you would want to be able to access your solar. But if you have no battery, you're just running power straight in there. It's going to go up and down. Sun, a cloud comes over. You're watching TV, it kind of dims out like you're,
Exactly. So that brings in another part.
Okay.
Load management within the circuits. Because basically what happens is the cloud comes over. If you're running things that exceed the capacity of your grid or of your array, it'll just shut off. It'll disconnect right then and there. Just overload, boom. Then the sun comes back out, it reconnects.
Your show comes back on?
They're basically wanting you to incorporate a lot of load management hardware and software into this system. And they're recommending you only run 2 120 volt circuits through this critical load panel if you're operating without batteries. So that you've limited your loads anyway to just a couple. You're probably going to use loads like refrigerators or things like that whether they turn on and off, not critical, because they're going to cool it down. So that was one of the issues. So I can see, okay, it has limited usefulness because of the variability.
Yeah.
Then you can put in small batteries, like just a small 3.6 kW battery bank. That's their smallest unit that comes with this. And so you might have a very large array, but now you've got 3.6 kW, which would even out some of that variability, so intermittent clouds, the battery will pick that up, but you're still only going to be running small loads. Then you're going to have whole house backup. where you require quite a lot more battery. But what they were getting into was that there's a battery to inverter ratio that currently exists. And so I did a lot of research on this because, like I said, it was new to me, and there is information, but you got to dig pretty deep out there. And it appears to only relate to AC coupled systems, because DC coupled systems, my understanding was, okay, you're feeding the array to the battery, the grid goes down. Well, now you've disconnected from the grid. Your battery and your array are now servicing whatever critical loads you've set up. It could be your whole house, whatever. If you're producing more power than you need, it just doesn't go anywhere, right? Your charge controller just sort of goes, well, we don't need it. It's an opportunity cost. You know, you could have been producing something, but you're not. Well, with the AC coupled system, it's not the array, it's not the DC, it's the inverter. And in this case, the microinverters that are pumping out power. And that's based on the amount of power hitting the solar array. But then it's got to go somewhere because it's coming from the inverter. And normally when you're connected to the grid, if you're overproducing, it'll just go onto the grid, but you're no longer connected to the grid. So what do? Well, you can physically curtail some of your production by turning things off if you happen to be there, but that's a pretty clumsy way of dealing with it. Yeah. So what they've come to is you've got to have a certain ratio of design size so your batteries don't get overwhelmed in amps by the amount of power that's coming from your inverter. And that has to do with a ratio of sizing of the battery-based inverter to the solar array inverter. Because remember, your inverter is not kicking AC directly into the battery. It's got to go through the battery-based inverter system before it's converted to DC, because it's an inverter charger. So what they're talking about basically is that the inverter charger that's taking the inverter's output of the array and putting it into the battery has to be sized in a way that it doesn't get overwhelmed in amps from the array's inverter.
Yeah, well, Jay, I'm just curious, the way you described that, it sounds a lot like the issue you'd have if you had a wind turbine up and you have to have a dump for when you've got more power than you need.
Yeah.
Why isn't that an issue? I understand they're putting it into the charger inverter, but what if the batteries are full? I mean, what happens? Do you still have to have a power dump or a load dump, whatever you call it, for the AC being generated?
I would think, unless there's some sort of disconnect within your inverter charger, you know, and all you're doing is protecting that it doesn't get overwhelmed with amps.
But even that, the inverter charger has to send the power someplace, because it's getting the power, it's getting the AC, and I can understand how it could stop sending DC, but the same issue with a wind turbine, you still got to direct it someplace, like put it into a hot water coil for a pool or something.
Yeah, like Eric, you remember when we were at Quiet Creek Ranch or Quiet Creek Farm, and they have a wind turbine and it's grid tied. And inside the pavilion was just a whole wall of resistors. And so their situation was, let's say that the wind turbine is generating power, but it's disconnected from the grid. Now I've got a load dump that has a certain capacity that will take all the power coming from that wind turbine. And that whole wall would just glow like a toaster if it were doing that, and just generate heat out to the outdoors. So I think, Don, you raise a good point. I need to do more research because this is it's a weird thing. I can see that it's an issue. Now what Enphase is saying is it's no longer an issue because their inverters are smart enough to shut down at the source and basically curtail power output based on perceived load demand. So they're going to be curtailing that solar at the microinverter level. So that's their cleverness they're talking about. So,
Is that some kind of a mechanical identification it's doing at the inverter with the load, or is it communications? Is it talking to a central something saying, we got more power we need, guys, turn it off? Or is it just they're somehow detecting that there's no need for power? I'm just
yeah,
curious.
it's got to be in the microinverter,
Okay.
so it's digital in some way because there are no moving parts. That's all solid state in there.
Yeah, I shouldn't say mechanical. I guess I should say is the microinverter communicating with some central location saying how much power we need, or is the microinverter just sensing how much power is being requested from the pseudo grid?
Yeah, it would have to be the second one, I would think.
Okay. Huh.
Because it needs to know. And if it's finding that it's being asked, it's got more power available than load demand,
Mm-hmm.
then it can curtail that somehow.
And if it could really do that, could you put that onto the wind turbines to solve their problem?
You would think, because they're all coming through a centralized inverter.
Yeah.
So maybe we're beginning to see this problem that we've just found exists is going to be no longer a problem.
Yeah.
By the time we get our brains around it.
I've asked. I know I use the what do you call them? The solar inverters, and their last version that came out had a wind turbine option or functionality. And when I've tried to call the guys on the helpline and ask, well, where's the load dump? I never really got an answer. So I don't know if they've solved it, or just the guys that I've gotten on the phone haven't really been as up to speed on it, what it was. But I'm curious if I wouldn't mind putting up a wind turbine where I've got stuff at night up on top of the very top of a hill. Might be nice to have in the winter times when there's less sun, something to kind of keep the batteries a little bit, topped up.
Yeah. Well, another takeaway from this Enphase webinar was basically now not all their microinverters are downwardly and upwardly compatible with some of these systems. So essentially only the IQ8 will work in the non-battery mode. So that's the electronics we've just been talking about, where apparently it can curtail output. Then the IQ7s, the IQ6, they can work with the battery. But then the M215s and the M250s, basically you're not supposed to mix and match within these, they call them their families of inverters. So for instance, if I've got, I have M215s and M250s on my array. If I wanted to incorporate some IQ8s, then I couldn't, they're not going to be completely compatible. I would have to, they would be in a straight grid tied system with no batteries and stuff, no problem, because they're just each acting independently. But if I want to incorporate a battery backup, I've got to then isolate the IQ8s or the IQ7s with that battery. So my M250s aren't going to work with their batteries as it exists today. So just worthy of noting. Another thing they brought up that I hadn't really considered, you guys may know about this, but hold down breakers, lockdown breakers, and they just mentioned it in passing, like, well, with this thing you don't need a lockdown breaker or whatever. And I was like, I don't even know what that is. And so it turns out if you've got a generator or a battery system that's in a DC coupled or an AC coupled system, if you're hooking into your breaker panel with that power source, there's a breaker type that you screw into the service panel so it can't accidentally be removed or on purpose removed, because that circuit, even once it's removed from the bus bar, could be live, could be generating power. So they don't want you to be able to remove it from the bus bar, and then you're holding a breaker that's generating power in your hand because it's coming from an alternative power source like a generator or a battery bank. So I've never really focused on that issue, but it makes a lot of sense that when you do hook in a battery bank system or a generator into your service panel, got to make sure those breakers are locked in place. So it takes, you know, several steps to remove that breaker. So
Do you think most electricians know this rule? I'm just curious.
I don't know. Most,
I'm thinking most-
they'll tell you they do. They'll tell you they do, but I don't know that they do.
I mean, the electricians I work with, I tell them what kind of stuff they have to do usually, and they're like, okay, because they're my cousins. I'm like, yeah, put it in here and do this and that. And they're like, okay, this is what the electrician rule says. But if there's something that's this specific, I'd be surprised if they knew it.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that came out of the research when I was looking up about the Enphase and the whole way that AC DC coupled systems work is the concept of voltage rise on the grid. And I know we've had some discussions about this in the past. Do your PV systems operate at the same voltage as the grid? And my perspective on it was they always have to synchronize with the grid. But apparently, they also, in that synchronization, have to operate at a slightly higher voltage than the grid so that the grid becomes the load in the case of overproduction, which makes sense from you know, a functional view of electricity, that electricity always goes from higher voltage to lower voltage. So your PV system has to go at a higher voltage system. It's just marginally higher, but it is higher. Well, in Australia, they're running into with grid saturation, that all of these systems are pumping slightly higher voltage out onto the grid, which is causing the grid voltage to increase. And it's causing the grid then to be pushed out of operational range, because if your neighbor pumps the grid up a little bit and then you have to go higher in order to get onto the grid. So you pump the grid a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And before you know it, they're outside of that 5% tolerance range. And that is becoming an issue in Australia. So just finding that as an interesting, oh, by the way, so they're beginning to look at how do we adjust for this? You know, how do we deal with this when we begin to see, you know, market saturation?
Did they say
solar.
what percentage caused that? What is that, like 10%, 20%, or?
I don't know. You know,
Okay.
they didn't get into that depth, at least as far as I read. But you know, I'm sure there's some PhD getting his doctoral thesis on that. You know, but it's something to consider. And I'm sure the inverters will begin to see this, understand it. Who knows? Maybe the grid will have to start, you know, they've got a plus or minus 5%. Well, they could begin setting their tolerance at the low end of that minus. They probably don't like that, of course, because it causes increased voltage drop. You know, the lower the voltage, the more losses they're going to experience.
Higher percentage.
So anyway, those were interesting. So those were the main thing. I don't think I have to share the slides, but the component pieces, another thing Enphase did is change the labels of a lot of their stuff, trying to give it more common sense naming instead of having communication as the envoy and this thing as the, everything always started with an E. Nobody could remember what they were. So now they're talking about like the IQ transfer switch instead of the exchange, you know, or things like that. So a little more common sense in their labeling. When I did some pricing, it looks like their 10 kW battery is $8,000, which pricey, but not hugely out of range. Like I think an equivalent Tesla Powerwall was in the 7,000, 6,000 range. The switch, the transfer switch was about $2,000. And then of course the other part is the the combiner box, but in a typical Enphase system now, that combiner box is part of every installation. That's about $600, $650. But it includes their communications software, hardware that was part of it. And that was usually about $600. So for $50 extra, you get a combiner box unit. And then they're talking a lot about load controllers. And these are circuit level load controllers. And I think we're seeing more and more of that in systems where the customer can begin to either manually or automatically set different controls on their loads, either at the appliance level or at the circuit level. And they're talking about, with their sunshine only system, having sequential load turn on and turn off so that they don't all crash at the same time. So you would prioritize your loads. You know, my air conditioner is one load, my refrigerator's another load, or whatever, my garage door. I don't quite get it. Everybody always says a garage door opener is a critical load. You know,
Well,
these are lazy people, you know.
Some of them, I don't think some of them, you can't disconnect the line to let it open.
Yeah, and maybe that's their main point of entry in their home, you know, who knows?
Yeah.
So it's like a front door lock. So anyway, I've never had a garage door opener, so I don't know. Well, I don't even have a garage. So we just park it under an oak tree and call it home. So, okay, so yeah, what I was finding though is with battery backup, it looked to me like we're currently with an Enphase system right at about $5 a watt. So if you're doing some pricing structure, you know, you could guesstimate about $2.50 a watt without battery, $5 a watt with battery, which not bad. I mean, doubling, you know.
How much battery, what's the ratio of battery backup? How did you figure, how big was it?
That was a 10 kW system,
Just
you know,
the
or 10 kW battery, which
Okay.
it would be a small home, you know, a very small home. They're saying 2 10 kWs for the typical home would be a whole house backup. So, you know, who knows? I'm thinking that when you do have battery backup, it should be an emergency situation. You know, otherwise you would be in your position where you build it as a standalone system.
Right.
So, anyway, those were the issues that I had here. Anybody else have anything for the good of the cause? Any experimentations out there? All right. Okie doke. Well, I'll see you guys next Tuesday. Have a nice Yule, and we'll talk again. All right. Take care.
That's good.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jay.